Okay, so the last video I'm going to do is, or last screencast I'm going to do, is a quick overview of the three cases that you're given as bigger precedent. These are considered to be the three things that help support both sides of the argument to some degree, that they're the most important cases. So what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of a quick overview and say how I think you should think about these cases as you read them. I want you to know this is not the most important thing. The other packet, which is the case problem that has the statement of facts, it has the relevant law, the EEOC enforcement manual, and then the appellant and respondent brief, that is significantly more important to what you're doing than this. This is now how you're going to take a good case that you're making a good argument and make it a little bit stronger. So in Thomas versus National Association of Letter Carriers, Thomas is basically the employee. Letter carriers are the union that are representing the mail carriers. And Thomas was a member of the Church of God. And as a result, because of his religious beliefs, he could not work on Saturday. And so basically they go through the background of the case, which I'm not going to walk you through. You can see that the discussion basically talks about the review that came up to the Supreme Court from a lower case. And really the key point of this case, and again, I'm not going to review a lot of it with you, is to know that ultimately the Supreme Court sided with the employer. And when the Supreme Court sided with the employer, they basically argued, sorry, we're moving past that, basically argued that it was because accommodating Thomas was creating an undue burden. And you can look through the arguments there to see which side you think helps you the most. Ultimately, if you are the appellant, meaning when you are supporting Abercrombie and Fitch, what you really want to do is make this case look as much like your accommodation as possible. So just like the letter carriers ultimately were not required by the Supreme Court to we're not required to accommodate Thomas completely with his beliefs, you're going to make the same argument that this is very similar to what Abercrombie is arguing. If you're on the respondent side, meaning the EOC and ELOF, then you're making the opposite argument. You're trying to say how this case is different. Certainly the similarity is that there is a religious situation going on here with both of them, Church of God versus, not versus, but as opposed to the Muslim situation that ELOF is in. And then the other difference would be that Thomas did attempt at least to accommodate Thomas, whereas Abercrombie never did. So again, I'm not scrolling through these cases because I'm going to give you any insight into them. I think you can read those on your own. But the EEOC versus Geo Group, basically this deals with a prison situation. Anybody who worked in the appeals court last year, remember our case also dealt with a prison situation. In this case, it's an employee dress code situation, and the three women who were involved in the case were Muslim, and they wanted to wear head coverings, and ultimately, when they started their employment, they were allowed to do that, and then because of a change in the dress code, they were no longer allowed to wear those. Again, there was no doubt here that notice had been given, so that's not really the issue. Just like with the first case, the Thomas case, the Geo Group case really deals with undue burden as the key. And here, what you want to see is the prison officials gave very similar testimony in many ways to what Abercrombie did, in the sense that they didn't have necessarily direct studies or hardcore evidence to back up their belief in undue burden, but it was there, in their opinion as experts, that this would cause an undue burden. That's obviously similar to the argument that Abercrombie and Finch is making, but again, on the ELOF EEOC side, you want to also, if I was arguing that side, draw the distinction between it might make sense for the Supreme Court to defer to prison officials because of the risk involved if they had to handle an undue burden, whereas the risk involved in Abercrombie dealing with that is certainly not as great. But again, in both Thomas and the Geo Group case, the notice part is not really an issue. It's the undue burden part. And so especially for those of you doing that side of the case, that's probably what you want to focus on. And again, the key thing, if you're arguing the Abercrombie side of undue burden, you're going to want to make it look as much like this Geo Group case as possible. If you're arguing the other side, the EEOC and ELOF side of the case, you want to make it seem as different from this as possible. Then I'm just moving through that quickly. Not as quickly as I would like to. And then we're finally coming to the last of the precedent cases they're giving you, which is the Toledo case. And this is the one case of the three that they ruled in favor of the person who was arguing for religious discrimination. So in the first two cases that we looked at, Thomas and the Geo Group case, both of those the employer won. And even though I think both sides can draw something from that, I think those tend to support the appellant side of the case more because the employee won on this side. I think this has a little bit, is more applicable to the respondent side of the case. And here you've got a trucker who was a member of a Native or an American Indian religion, and as a result used peyote occasionally. And so you need to look at what peyote is. It's a naturally occurring, but nonetheless something that is considered a narcotic. And ultimately, the Noble Group, Noble Cisco, was trying to hire him as a trucker, and ultimately they did not hire him because he had this religious use of peyote, and they felt that violated several laws concerning drug testing and the like that truckers had to go through. Really, the key to this is ultimately that the employee, in this case Toledo, won. And so if you are on the EEOC side of an argument, especially concerning undue burden, almost all of these focus on undue burden, that this supports, you want to see how this supports the ELOF side, the fact that they were not able to show undue burden. The other thing that's probably worth looking at with this case is the fact that the Nobel Cisco company did not initially offer Toledo an accommodation. It was only after they were sued that the offer of accommodation came. But that's not, even though that's not exactly like the case we're doing, that is similar in the sense that Abercrombie never offered ELOF an accommodation. And as you go through this case, you will see that the 10th Circuit kind of holds Nobel Cisco to a slightly higher standard because they didn't offer an accommodation initially and only did so after a lawsuit had been brought. And clearly, just to clarify, there has been no offer of an accommodation from Abercrombie Fitch, but that's at least somewhat of a similarity here. And so again, almost all three of these cases, they really focus primarily, if not exclusively, on the undue burden side of the case. And the first two sided with employers, so I think they help the appellant side a little bit more if you're making that argument, especially on undue burden, because on the Toledo case, the court sided with the employee. It's probably a little bit more useful for the appellant side of the case. Again, hope these have been useful for you. I'm certainly happy to answer any questions. I'm going to post my contact information on the Youth and Government website, and so I'll answer any questions that come to me through that. Thank you, and I appreciate you listening to my screencasts.